You will get nothing." My father stood up in the middle of the dinner table, his voice sharp as a blade. "Brooks Systems has been sold. Everything is done, and Savannah, you are not part of it." The room went silent. Only the faint clink of a wine glass against the table edge broke the stillness. My mother, Lillian Monroe, froze for a moment, her lips twitching. Then she stayed silent. Colton, my eldest brother, raised his eyebrows with a smirk, pouring himself more wine like he was watching some comedy. Sierra, my youngest sister, who lives her life on social media, only looked up from her phone long enough to adjust her camera angle, then went right back to making her tragic face for her live stream. And me, I just sat there, at the lavish Thanksgiving dinner table, under the glow of crystal chandeliers, surrounded by Wedgwood china plates and Waterford crystal glasses. I turned to Stone. "I am Savannah Brooks, 32 years old, the second child in a family of 3. Daughter of Douglas Brooks, founder of one of New Hampshire's leading software companies, Brooks Systems." And that night, right in the middle of family dinner, he flatly announced he had sold the company for $50 million, without mentioning my name in any part of the deal. No shares, no explanation, not even a glance in my direction. Colton, the eldest son, never wrote a single line of code, yet was appointed vice president right after graduation. Sierra, the youngest, is famous online as the software princess, even though she's never set foot in the company office a single day. And me, I went to Stanford, wrote my first software at 15, and was the only one who saved the company from a major crisis by proposing we migrate our entire data system to the cloud. But in my father's eyes, I was still just a shadow. I remember one board meeting a few years ago. I was presenting a brand new strategy that was detailed, innovative, and completely feasible. My father cut me off halfway, leaned back in his chair, and gave me a small smile. "Sounds cute, sweetheart. But let's leave business talk to the men." Everyone laughed. I laughed too, but it was a laugh, steeped in bitterness. After his announcement that night, I didn't say a word. I just lifted my glass of water and took a small sip. My mother looked at me, said nothing, and only lowered her gaze. Sierra whispered to me, "Don't be upset. You've always been strong. Strong, I didn't need them to think I was strong. I just wanted to be seen." That night, when everyone drifted away, I quietly went up to my old room, the room where I had once sketched out my very first business plan. I opened my laptop. On the screen was the dashboard of Summit Edge Ventures, the company I had founded and secretly run for the past 10 years. My father had no idea. No one in the family did. Every line of revenue was a cut against the past. Every growth milestone was my silent act of defiance. I hadn't given up. I had only chosen silence. Tomorrow, he will sign the official transfer papers, but he will never see it coming. That the company acquiring Brooks Systems Summit Edge Ventures is owned by none other than his daughter, Savannah Brooks. I once wanted my father to see me. Now, I want him to see the daughter he has lost. If you've ever been rejected by your own family, if you know what it feels like to be overlooked, no matter how hard you've tried, subscribe to Revenge Mark so you won't miss the next chapter. This is only the beginning. I just sat by the window of my old room, watching the yellow light reflect on the snow-covered yard outside. The mansion was eerily quiet, as if everything had just ended. But inside me, something had only just begun. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. The darkness helped me hide the one thing I had learned to conceal since I was a child: pain. I used to think if I studied a little harder, behaved a little better, worked a little more diligently, then Dad would see me. A glance of recognition, a nod, a genuine compliment. But what I always got was comparison. Colton is the more suitable heir. He has leadership in his blood. A daughter like Savannah is only fit for technical work. Don't dream of running the company. And I believed him. I believed that men were indeed better. I believed that if I just kept my head down and worked hard, the results would speak for themselves. I was wrong. 11 p.m. I lay on my old bed. Still the same blue-striped sheets. The old quilt with my name stitched in the corner. The only warmth came from memories. But even memories couldn't save a heart that was breaking in my chest. The most painful part wasn't being cut out of the contract. It was knowing they didn't feel a shred of pain doing it to me. My mother, the one who always taught me to endure, sat quietly, just like she always did. No objections, no defense. She always chose keeping the peace over justice. Sierra never even looked me in the eye. She live-streamed the entire evening as if our family drama was great material for engagement. And Colton? He downed his third glass of wine, winked at me after Dad left the table, and murmured, "Don't get upset, sis. This is the real world, not one of your Stanford classes anymore." I said nothing, but in my mind, I could hear my own voice. The real world? Huh. Then you'd better get ready to live in it. Colton. Maybe I was wrong to think. Family was a place I'd always belong. I studied hard and came back to work without pay for 2 whole years to help pull the company out of crisis. I stayed through the latest nights, fixing system bugs, negotiating contracts, writing proposals, and in the end, I was just a name deleted from the shareholder list with a single click. I stayed up almost all night, sitting in front of my laptop, staring at the financial dashboard of Summit Edge Ventures. Every number flashing across the screen seemed to whisper to me, "You don't need anyone's permission to prove your worth." But my heart hadn't caught up with my mind. There was still that feeling of being left behind, of being betrayed, of being treated as disposable. I remembered the first email I sent to Dad when I proposed the idea of digital transformation. I believe that by implementing cloud technology, Brooks Systems could reduce operating costs by up to 27%. I've put together a detailed plan. Dad replied with a single line. The idea's too student-like. Savannah, drop it. A few months later, Colton presented it. Word for word. Dad praised him for being innovative, with vision. I wanted to scream. But at that moment, I smiled instead. That familiar smile. The kind of women in my family always used to swallow their tears. The next morning, as the winter sunlight streamed through the curtains, I still hadn't slept. I closed my laptop, stood up, looked in the mirror. That face was no longer Douglas Brooks' daughter. It was the CEO of Summit Edge. And today, I was going to face him. But was I ready? When for the first time? I wasn't just the daughter, but the opponent. I stood frozen in the bathroom, my hands gripping the edge of the icy porcelain sink. The water ran steadily, but my mind felt shattered, like a stream blocked mid-flow. Eyes swollen, throat bitter, heart unbearably heavy. Everything from last night kept replaying in my head, like a damaged tape stuck on repeat. My father's words, "You get nothing," cold, final, leaving no way back, and the way the whole family fell silent. That silence told me I was fighting this battle alone. I put on my old wool cardigan and slowly made my way down to the kitchen at 7 a.m. Maria, our longtime cook, was still preparing breakfast. She turned around, eyes wide. "Miss Savannah, you're still here." I gave a small nod, pulling out a chair at the wooden table near the window. A moment later, she set a steaming cup of tea in front of me without asking anything further. She only said, "I heard some things last night. I'm sorry." Strange, isn't it? How an apology from someone completely unrelated could make me want to cry more than any word from my own blood. At that moment, I had planned to leave this house. I wanted to catch the earliest flight back to San Francisco, back to my work, and back to the life where no one knew I was Douglas Brooks's daughter. But then, I heard Colton's voice echoing from the hallway. Summit Edge. Nobody even knows who their CEO is. It could just be a puppet for some big guys hiding in the background. You'll see Dad will sell for an even higher price. My heart stopped for a beat. Summit Edge. The company I poured 10 years of my youth into building. The dream I quietly nurtured night after night in a cramped rented room in the heart of California. The one part of me I had never truly shared with anyone in my family. And now, my brother, a man who couldn't even handle a basic integration tool, was talking about it like some cheap, disposable commodity. I walked back to my room and closed the door. I opened my laptop, logged into the shareholder management system. I had been preparing for this for the past 2 years, quietly buying back shares from minor partners, suppliers, and third-party holders. No name attached. No Brooks label. Only my father had no idea. The noose was slowly tightening. I wasn't out for revenge. Once, I had only wanted recognition. I used to think, one day, my father would call me into his office, place a hand on my shoulder, and say, "I need you." But after last night, I realized it wasn't that I wasn't good enough. It was that they were never enough to understand me. That dinner didn't kill me. It only burned away the last piece of me that still believed in family loyalty. I no longer wanted to go back. I wanted to rise above. That night, I rewrote the plan. No longer the vague strategy it had been before, but step by step, crystal clear. Acquire more shares in the 2 minor partner companies. Activate the right of first refusal with the domestic supply chain. And most importantly, schedule the official purchase offer for Brooks Systems in the name of Summit Edge Ventures, Representative S. E. Vaughn. A name my family had never heard before, but soon would never forget. I sat there, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes, alone, quiet, calm to the point of being unnerving. This was no longer Savannah waiting to be recognized. This was the woman who would buy the very seat that had been pulled out from under her. But if I truly went through with this, would I still be myself 3 days after that fateful dinner? I left the Brooks mansion with nothing but a single suitcase. No one saw me off. No one tried to stop me. Not even a single person asked where I was going. Perhaps, in their eyes, I was nothing more than a passerby making a brief stop. Once again, the flight from New Hampshire back to San Francisco took nearly 6 hours. I sat by the window, listening to jazz through my headphones, my mind completely clear. The view of the sky outside drifted past like a slow-motion film, but inside my head, each thought raced like a runaway machine. No emotions, no panic, only action. When I arrived at my penthouse in Mission Bay, I stood under a cold shower for almost 10 minutes, not to wake myself up, but to wash off the old emotions clinging stubbornly to my skin. I stood before the mirror. My hair was still wet. My eyes were slightly swollen from sleepless nights, but inside, something had shifted. I was no longer Savannah of the Brooks family. I was S.E. Vaughn. the elusive female CEO who once caused a stir in the startup market by orchestrating a merger with 3 major software platforms without ever revealing her identity. No one knew who I was, and this time, I would use that to my advantage. I opened my laptop and accessed Summit Edge's financial control system. A chart appeared. The platform was stable. Quarterly profits had exceeded 12%. Cash flow was healthy, not swayed by any major investor. This was the moment. But before I struck my final blow, I needed to transform myself. I began again, starting from the smallest things: my wardrobe, my demeanor, the way I entered a room. I hired a body language expert not to make myself colder, but to learn how to ensure no one would ever dare to underestimate me again. I spent nearly a month restructuring Summit Edge's personnel. I handed over authority to the COO, accelerated the digitization process, and eliminated all leaks of my identity. I went to the gym every morning, not for my appearance, but because every punch, every sit-up, was how I trained my willpower. I reread all past correspondence between Brook Systems and its partners. I found a very small detail about a legal loophole in the contract between Brooks and the regional distributor for the West Coast. An opportunity. I called Ava, my best friend, who is now a senior strategic attorney in Los Angeles. Ready to place a big bet, I asked over the phone. As long as it's legal. It is. But it might keep a few people up at night. We spent 3 straight days in the office on the 48th floor, printing every page of the files, marking every clause. I rewrote the entire acquisition proposal this time, not as an ordinary deal, but as a full-scale takeover. I no longer dreamed of being invited into the boardroom. I would flip that boardroom over. On the 21st day since leaving the mansion, I got the news. One of the 3 minority shareholders had agreed to sell the remainder of their shares, exchanging them for equity in Summit Edge and benefits in the European branch. I now had enough to control the game. I stood by the glass wall, looking out at the city sinking into the evening fog, espresso in hand, back straight. What I felt wasn't hatred. It was the calm of someone who knew with certainty that victory was within reach. If I had once been erased with nothing more than an email, this time, I would carve my name in ink that could never be erased. Monday, 7:00 a.m. I put on a charcoal gray suit, my hair neatly tied up, and my makeup done just enough to convey seriousness, not showiness. Holding a slim document briefcase in my hand, I walked into the tallest building in Boston's commercial district. On the 39th floor, there is the conference room of one of Brook Systems' 3 main suppliers, Davenport Digital Logistics. No one in the room knew who I was. Only a business card reads E. Vaughn, Senior Strategy Director, Summit Edge Ventures, Ms. Vaughn. I have to say, Summit Edge's proposal really caught us off guard. The CEO of Davenport, a man in his 60s, leaned back in his chair, his tone a mix of skepticism and respect. Acquiring all Western distribution rights and proposing further investment in our logistics system. Is there any reason to believe this isn't just a temporary move? I smiled, carefully laying each page of the documents on the table. Not a single unnecessary word, not a single sign of haste. Because we don't invest in retreat. We invest to dominate. The deal was signed after only 3 days of negotiation. Davenport officially cut its priority contract with Brook Systems. At the same time, it announced its new partner, Summit Edge Ventures, to the press. The news spread quickly. No one in the tech industry realized that the woman behind this deal was the daughter Douglas Brooks had shut out of the family dinner less than a month ago. 3 days later, I approached the headquarters of Nexware, a company specializing in warehouse management platforms, a branch that had once been the lifeline of Brooks Systems. I didn't need to show up in person. I simply sent a package of emails containing internal information, evidence of Colton using his system access to inflate order prices by 1.5 times. Internal conversations between Nextware's customer service department and Brooks' side involved Brooks' representative Colton insulting and threatening the staff. I added nothing else. Just signed at the bottom sender S. E. Vaughn, the one who was once shut out without so much as a glance back. 5 days later, an article exploded on a reputable business forum, headlined, "Incompetent Air Brooks Systems Faces Internal Reputation Crisis." Not long after, I received insider news an emergency meeting had been convened among the company's board members. For the first time in over 20 years, Douglas Brooks was being questioned by the very board he had once controlled absolutely. I sat in my office, fingers lightly stroking the cold wooden desk. A strange feeling crept into my heart. I had struck back. But instead of satisfaction, all I felt was an emptiness. I opened my old inbox. The first email I sent to my father 10 years ago, when I was still at Stanford. The handwriting is still neat. The content is still innocent, Dad. I have this idea for the operating interface. He never replied. Now I no longer needed an answer. I no longer needed permission. I had learned that if you want a seat in that room of power, sometimes you have to rebuild the entire table yourself. If you've ever been shut out because of your gender, your age, or simply because you weren't the one they chose, subscribe to Revenge Mark. Because sometimes the quietest person is the one steering the whole game. Next Monday. I had just stepped into my office when my assistant knocked and handed me that morning's financial newspaper. Front page, right-hand column, a headshot of Colton Brooks, his face tense, lips pressed tight, and a heavy headline, "Brooks Systems Internal Weakness Exposed, Western Supply Chain Collapses, Shareholder Confidence Shaken." I folded the paper shut. No smile, no gloating, because I knew the counterattack was about to begin. 11:07 a.m. The first message popped up. Colton just appeared on the morning finance show. They denied all allegations. Not long after, I received the recording. Colton was in a gray suit, wearing a navy blue tie, the Brooks Systems signature color whenever they wanted to win back investor trust. What's happening is the result of an organized smear campaign. We are working with investigative authorities and will clarify any wrongdoing. If there is any, he looked straight into the camera. I want to send a message to the person behind this information. We know who you are, and you will be held accountable. I leaned back in my chair. That last line wasn't for the TV audience. It was a warning sent directly to me. 5:00 p.m. that afternoon, Ava, my lawyer and close friend, called. Her voice low. I just got word from the bank. Someone filed a request for a 5-year reverse tax audit on the Summit Edge account from the IRS. I gripped the phone tightly. Anything we can do? Of course. Everything's legal. But Savannah, they're trying to scare you. Then they've forgotten where I grew up. That night, I didn't go home. I drove to the southern beach outside the city, sat on the hood of my car, watching waves crash against the rocks, listening to the wind cut past my ears, trying to steady my own heartbeat. I knew, revenge is never one way. Once you make someone who's been sitting on a throne feel threatened, they won't just sit still. Douglas Brooks would not sit still. 3 days later, Brooks Systems held a press conference announcing a post-crisis recovery investment package. They unveiled plans to expand into the Asian market, a risky move, but one investors found tempting. My father, Douglas, appeared in his familiar black suit, voice calm and deep, eyes sharp like a velvet-sheathed blade. "We are not just recovering, we are preparing for the next era." A reporter asked about the recent negative press. He only replied briefly, "When you do things right, there will be people who try to pull you down, but we always find a way to stand back up and pull them down instead." I knew that pull was coming, and it did. The next morning, an article began circulating on startup forums. Headline: Summit Edge Ventures. The mysterious CEO behind a series of shady deals. It quoted cases of several companies I had acquired, described as shark-style takeovers, founder dispossession, and identity concealment. Not wrong, but not entirely true. They were trying to paint me as a cold phantom without feelings, without roots. I read through the comments. Some agreed, some questioned it. I don't fear being hated, I just hate being misunderstood. That night, in the quiet room, Ava placed a hand on my shoulder. "You could stop now. Savannah, Summit Edge is big enough. You don't need to prove anything anymore." I looked straight into her eyes. "I'm not doing this to prove a point. I'm doing this to take back what was always mine." But was I truly ready to face my father head-on, when now, he too had begun to fight with everything he had Friday? 9:00 a.m. The Brooks Systems shareholders' meeting room was packed. On the wall, a projector displayed revenue charts, financial statements, and a faint blank space on the ownership map, the section that had been transferred to an unidentified party. Douglas Brooks sat at the head of the table. Colton was to his right. My mother, Lillian Monroe, was absent. I, of course, was also absent, but my name was right there in the documents they were holding. No one knew it was me. That afternoon, a leading financial newspaper broke the news Summit Edge acquires 3 of Brooks Systems' strategic partners, revaluing the entire supply chain network. The article included an analysis of a 23% drop in Brooks Systems' valuation in just 6 weeks. Investors began to panic. Some hinted they wanted to pull out. Douglas held a closed-door meeting with the board that very night. I knew this was the moment to move. Not with another article, but with action. I sent one final proposal this time, not anonymously, direct, straightforward. Opening with "Dear members of the Brooks Systems Board. My name is Savannah Brooks, and I am a shareholder of 18% of the company's total value. I am currently co-owner of its key supply chains and critical data systems. I propose to buy back a majority stake in the company at a fair valuation and, more importantly, to implement a survival strategy that will protect the Brooks name." The silence lasted 48 hours. By Sunday afternoon, Ava forwarded me an unofficial memo from the board. Short, urgent. We agreed to negotiate, but off the record, and without the press. I nodded. Finally, the door had opened, not because they trusted me, but because they had no one else to trust. The meeting took place at a boutique hotel on the outskirts of Boston. I stepped into a warm, wood-paneled room lit with soft, golden light. Douglas sat there for the first time alone. When he saw me, his hand tightened slightly, but he said nothing. I pulled out a chair, sat across from him, and calmly opened my folder. No posturing, no triumph in my voice. Just a woman offering another path, a lifeline for the very family company that once rejected her. The meeting lasted 3 hours. He spoke little, mostly listened. Colton was not invited. Sierra's name never came up. When I finished presenting the restructuring plan, I didn't wait for praise. I stood quietly. I'm not here to beg. I'm here because I believe Brooks Systems is still worth saving, just not the old way. I turned and walked out, not knowing what he would decide. 3 days later, the reply came by email. The board agrees to sell 49% of shares to Summit Edge Ventures, provided the founder's title remains and the CEO role is transferred to the new representative. I let out a small laugh. They wanted to save face. Fine. I could give them that. But the power that had been mine the moment they reached the third line of my plan, the very next day, the financial press carried the headlines, Summit Edge takes over management of Brooks Systems. Savannah Brooks returns to the forefront, no longer in the shadows. I sat in my new office on the 20th floor at Brooks Systems headquarters. Looking out the window, the city looked the same. But inside me, something was settling, not satisfied, but the feeling of finally being seen. Still, I knew this wasn't the end, because a man like Douglas Brooks would never let someone strip away his power without a fight. I used to think, maybe this time, he would choose silence. That was when I walked into the new office as the one in charge. Douglas Brooks, the father, the founder, the man who once declared I would get nothing, would take a step back. I had underestimated him. Monday, 6:13 a.m. I was about to start the weekly meeting with the engineering department when Ava called. Her voice was deadly serious. You need to see this right now. A file came through. A string of leaked emails from a year ago between a mid-level director at Summit Edge and the finance department. Subject line, urgent merger handling. No need for deep audit, a phrase. Enough to raise suspicion, enough to be twisted. Before noon, the media had pounced. Did Summit Edge bypass audits before acquisitions? Did the new CEO of Brooks Systems have shady dealings? The articles kept rolling in. Several major investors began freezing their shares temporarily. A group of minority shareholders demanded an emergency meeting to reassess the current leadership role. Not even 8 hours. With a flick of Douglas's hand, the seat I had just taken was already shaking. I understood. This was how he reacted when cornered. No need to step in directly, just release a puff of smoke and wait for others to revolt. That afternoon, I drove alone to the docks, the place where I'd worked as a college student, packing boxes for a tiny startup. The cold ocean wind slapped against my face. The smell of old wood, machine oil, and salt water snapped me back to the present. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. But my hands trembled. It had taken me nearly 10 years to climb from the bottom to the top. I would not let myself collapse just because an old knife had been sharpened again. But what stung wasn't his blow. It was the reaction of those I once thought would stand by me. One board advisor called me privately and said, "We need to protect the company's public image. If you resign, everything will calm down." Calm down. Is that what they call being pushed out? Yet again, that night, I went back to my apartment and turned off every light. Sat on the floor, my back against the wall. The feeling wasn't fear. It was a searing kind of isolation. I could hear the distant hum of the city, feel my breathing slow. And then, a message popped up from an unknown number. "If you want to save the company, meet me, but no one can know." See, I knew instantly who it was. Colton. But why? At this moment, was he reaching out his hand, and was this a lifeline or a velvet noose Colton chose to meet me in a quiet bar in the basement of the Old Town District, a place that used to be a secret meeting spot for startup folks 10 years ago? I arrived right on time. No lipstick, no laptop, just a steady gaze and a mindset expecting nothing kind. Colton was sitting there, swirling a glass of whiskey, eyes fixed on the wooden floor. The warm yellow light cast something across his face, something almost like regret. "I didn't come here to apologize." He spoke before I could. Good. Because I don't need it, I replied, my tone cold. He exhaled, took a sip of whiskey, then looked up at me for the first time in years. Douglas doesn't play fair. You already know that. I've known for a long time, but now he doesn't just want to cut you out. He wants to drag you all the way down, permanently. I stayed silent, waiting for the core of it. And then it came. I have a copy of the old files. These are things that can prove he orchestrated the leak. But you need to know, if this goes public, he will be completely ruined. Colton looked at me, eyes a little red. Not from the alcohol. Are you ready to do that to Dad? I didn't answer. I stood up, walked out of the bar. Cold. Not from the Boston wind, but from the price I was about to face. That night, I went home, turned on the dim lights, and played an old instrumental track. The kind of acoustic guitar that used to make me feel safe now seemed to drain me of energy. I sat in the middle of the spacious living room, hugging a pillow, staring at the stack of documents Colton had secretly sent over after our meeting. Each page, like a small blade, slicing into trust that had long since rotted away. I used to think I'd gotten used to betrayal. I used to believe that feeling could no longer reach me, but the truth is, I still hoped that one day Dad would call, not for the sake of reputation or power, but just to say one thing: I'm proud of you. That sentence never came, and maybe it never will. The phone rang. Ava. I didn't pick up. I didn't have the strength to listen to another plan, another strategy, another piece of advice. Right now, I don't need a lawyer. I just wanted someone to understand. I went into my room and opened the bottom drawer, a piece of old, yellowed paper. It was a letter from my grandfather, Robert Brooks, the original founder of the company, the only person who ever told me, you don't need to be chosen, you just need to choose yourself. I read it again. The handwriting is shaky, but clear. I cried. For the first time in years, I let the tears fall without forcing them back. That night, I didn't sleep. I wrote. Not a business plan, but a resignation letter, a draft. Was I ready to let go? I didn't know. All I knew was that I was tired and hurting, not because I was attacked, but for the past 10 years, I'd been trying to prove myself to someone I should never have had to prove anything to in the first place. But if I walked away right now, would I still be Savannah Brooks, the one who rose every time she was cast aside, or just a lost girl, worn out among the ashes I don't remember when I drifted off? All I know is that when I woke up, sunlight was pouring through the large living room window. Everything was still a mess. The laptop was still open. The resignation letter was still on the screen. Cold coffee sat untouched on the table, and my heart still ached. I walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. Empty. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I placed my hand on the marble countertop and closed my eyes. No prayers, no hope for miracles, just wanting a few seconds of peace, a small ding from my phone, a text from Ava. Don't reply, but if you're still able to stand, come to the Cornerstone building, 18th floor. Someone wants to see you. I didn't reply. I simply washed my face, changed my coat, and left the house. The Cornerstone building was tucked between sleek modern office towers, small, quiet, and unassuming. 18th floor, frosted glass door, no sign. I knocked. The person who opened the door was Helena, the former housekeeper for my family. She looked older. Her eyes deepened, but her voice was still in the same gentle tone as before. Savannah. Come in, dear. I sat down without asking anything. Helena poured tea and placed the cup in front of me. She didn't wait for me to speak. Your father once came here. I looked up. About 6 years ago, after your grandfather passed. He didn't know I had kept the letters Robert wrote to you, but I knew. Your grandfather always believed you were the only one who truly carried his blood. I froze. Helena opened a small wooden box. Inside were the letters. The handwriting was familiar. Each line was something my grandfather had never said out loud. Savannah has the eyes of someone who doesn't need to fight for anything, yet is always forced to prove she's worthy. I fear Douglas will never understand her because he only believes in what he can control. I burst into tears. This time, not from pain, but because I realized I wasn't completely alone. That afternoon, I went back to the Summit Edge office. The employees looked at me with worried eyes. I nodded at each of them, sat at my desk, turned on my computer, deleted the draft resignation letter. I called Ava. I'm still here. She was silent for a few seconds, then replied, and we still have one card left to play. That night, I reopened the letter Colton had sent me, read every line carefully. There was a key part in email exchange between Douglas and a foreign investor, showing he had attempted to sell the rights to the Brooks software to a third party without the board's approval. Illegal. A breach of the founding agreement. And most importantly, it could be criminally prosecuted. I wasn't shaking anymore. I saw it clearly now. I wasn't seeking revenge to destroy everything. I was standing up to protect the part of the legacy worth preserving. I wouldn't keep going out of anger. I would keep going for my grandfather, for Helena, for myself. And this time, I would not back down. If you've ever felt like you were the only one standing in the middle of the storm, remember sometimes just one ray of light is enough to rebuild an entire life. Don't miss the next part. Subscribe to Revenge Mark to see what happens when the one cast aside comes back to reclaim the game. I wasn't trembling anymore. Not because everything had settled down, but because I knew that this time, I was stepping into the final battle with my eyes wide open and my mind completely clear. In the closed office of Summit Edge, Ava and I sat facing each other. 3 folders stamped with red seals laid out on the table between us. One was a scanned copy of an email Douglas had sent to a Korean investor. Short, concise, but carrying full criminal implications. We can negotiate independent licensing as long as you don't go through the current board. I had read this 5 times, and each time, my heart grew a little colder. The second folder was a full copy of last year's audited financial statements, showing that Douglas had quietly moved Brooks' core software out of company assets to create a so-called separate project. This so-called expansion project was really just a springboard to make his escape before everything collapsed. The third and most important was a list of neutral shareholders, people who had never taken sides before, but who now knew exactly who had a real plan. I nodded. Ava didn't ask anything. She understood. It was time. The comprehensive shareholders meeting was reconvened by the book. No press, no live stream, just the same people who had once sat quietly, letting men like Douglas and Colton decide the fate of this company. This time, I didn't wear a suit. I chose a white shirt, ash gray slacks, and no jewelry. I didn't need to prove I was successful. I came here to prove I had the strength to hold on to what was worth holding on to. Douglas walked into the meeting room right on time. His eyes swept over me as if looking at a former employee who had come crawling back to ask for a job. I didn't respond. Colton wasn't there. I guessed he knew when to retreat. Ava spoke first. She restated the reason the meeting had been reconvened. Her voice was low, steady, without a trace of spite, each sentence striking the glass table like a hammer. Then it was my turn. I kept my remarks short. No wandering. I didn't talk about past wounds. I only laid out the numbers, the plan, the strategy, as if I had never been shut out of the boardroom, as if this were a company I had never shed tears over. Finally. I pulled from my shirt pocket a copy of Douglas's email. I didn't want to use this, I said slowly, my gaze steady. But if you continue to use the Brooks Systems name to serve your personal deals, I will have no choice but to send it to the Federal Financial Oversight Committee. The room went silent. Douglas gripped the arms of his glasses. A muscle in his cheek twitched. For the first time, he had nothing to say. The vote began. Each yes that rang out was like a pair of scissors snipping through an old, tangled rope. I didn't watch the people casting their votes. I kept my eyes fixed on the company logo on the wall, 3 diagonal lines representing 3 generations of Brooks. Today, for the first time, I saw myself in it. The vote ended. Douglas was stripped of his honorary chairman title. Control was handed entirely to Summit Edge's representative for the next 6 months. I said nothing as he rose and walked out of the room. No insults, no turning my head. I had won, but I felt no triumph, because sometimes an ending isn't the sound of applause. It's a long enough silence for you to realize you've stepped out of the past and you have no desire to go back. 3 days before the official announcement of Brooks Systems restructuring, I sat in my office on the 20th floor, watching the quiet afternoon light spill across the new logo on the wall. Brooks Systems is a member of Summit Edge. Just a few words. But to get them, I had walked a path no one on the outside could ever fully understand. The phone rang. Ava, prepare yourself. Someone wants to meet in person one last time. Who him? Douglas Brooks. We arranged to meet in a small conference room inside an old hotel neutral ground, no one holding home court advantage. I arrived first. No makeup. No armor. I didn't need another layer of cover for a meeting I knew would strip everything bare. Douglas walked in, still in that perfectly tailored gray suit, still wearing those polished leather shoes as if they had never known a misstep. But there was something different about him now. No longer the imposing stance, only the heaviness of an empire quietly crumbling. He sat down, not looking at me, but staring straight out the window. The early winter wind in Boston made the glass tremble faintly. I used to think, you wouldn't dare go this far. I kept my voice steady. Maybe because you never let me go. He turned. His gaze had lost its sharpness. What remained was fatigue. Like a warrior drained of all strength, yet still unwilling to drop his sword. I know everything. Colton, Ava, even Helena, they're all on your side. I gave a small nod. No denial, no diminishing it. Then he smiled, lightly, briefly. You're better than I thought. I stayed silent. And I have been worse than you imagined. It wasn't an apology, but it was no longer an accusation either. And in that moment, I saw a father, not a CEO, just a man who once believed control was love, and in doing so, lost the very thing he loved most. I didn't forgive him, not in that moment, but I no longer hated him either, because recognition had finally arrived, not from the press, not from the board, but from the one who had once pushed me down the hardest. Before standing up, he turned and asked Will, "You keep the company name?" I looked him straight in the eye. "Not for you. For Grandpa?" Douglas froze for a moment, Then he nodded, slightly, like a bow, perhaps one he had never made in his life. That evening, I stood alone in the empty office. The staff had gone home. The room held only the sound of the wind pressing against the glass. I opened my laptop, preparing the documents for the press conference. Headline, The Journey of Revival. From an old legacy to a future worthy of it. Everything was ready. The documents, the shares, the team, and within me, I was ready too. But just before turning off the lights, I picked up my phone. A message from an unknown number popped up. Don't think it's over. See you at the press conference. I have a gift for you. S. Sierra. My younger sister. The one who never cared about anything beyond likes and flattering camera angles. And now, she was stepping in just when I thought everything had finally been settled. Monday, the day of the official press conference announcing the restructuring of Brooks Systems. 9 a.m., the main building was packed with media. I stood in the prep room, holding my speech notes, yet my mind wasn't lingering on each line. The message from Sierra was still there, glowing on my phone screen like a challenge. I have a gift for you. Sierra, my younger sister, the one who had never shown up at any meeting, the one who once burst out laughing when I talked about our data systems, now, suddenly wanting to step into the spotlight right as the final spotlight was about to fade. I had no time to guess. All I could do was brace myself to see everything clearly without blinking. 10:07 a.m. The event began. I stepped onto the stage, the lights shining straight into my face. Not blinding, but hot. Down below, the board of shareholders, the press, old and new employees, and Douglas is sitting quietly at the far end of the row. I began my speech. My voice didn't shake. I wasn't reading word for word. I was speaking from my heart. Today isn't the beginning of a new company. It's the day Brooks Systems lifts its head, after looking straight at itself. We're not changing to erase the past, but to be worthy of the future. I saw heads nodding, eyes focused. I saw Ava standing in the back, hands clenched, her gaze telling me, "You've done it." But just as I was about to close, the sharp click of high heels echoed. Sierra, stepping onto the stage in a white dress, with softly curled hair and a confident smile. I froze. Sorry, big sister. I just want to add a few things about the future you just mentioned. The room stirred. I held the mic steady. Sierra, this isn't the you've always thought you were the only one who had to endure. You forgot. You're not the only one who was pushed aside. She pulled an envelope from her purse and held it high for everyone to see. This is the brand image licensing agreement for Brooks Systems, authorized by Douglas Brooks, signed with a global media company, making me the official face of the brand. The room went silent. I looked straight at that document. I knew it was real. Douglas had quietly negotiated to turn Brooks Systems into a lifestyle brand, leveraging Sierra's image to redirect the company's public presence. And he had done it before being ousted. I drew in a deep breath. No anger, no fear, just clarity. I looked at my sister, the one who had once been sheltered, then cast aside by the very prejudices of our family. And now, just as I had once done, she stood here, demanding her place. I took a step forward. My gaze softened. If that's real, I won't deny it. But today, Brooks Systems doesn't belong to anyone. Not me. Not Dad. Not you. It belongs to everyone willing to rebuild it from the ground up. I paused for a few seconds, then went on. And if you truly want to stand with us, instead of just standing in front of the cameras, I'll give you a chance. But not through a contract, through real work. Sierra froze. I saw her hand tighten. Her eyes blinked rapidly. Something softened in her. She turned toward the press. I'll think about it. Then she walked off the stage, without looking back. I turned back to the mic. No need for a closing line. The story had just ended its own chapter. But I knew this was only the end of one chapter, not the book. The press conference ended at exactly 11:46 a.m., but its aftershocks lingered for weeks afterward. The next morning, the news flooded social media. Reactions split sharply into two camps. One side hailed me as the woman who resurrected a fallen empire. The other side questioned, is Savannah Brooks really any different from Douglas Brooks? If she also pruned the past to rebuild power for herself, I didn't argue. I didn't need to, because I knew justice doesn't always come with unanimous applause. I received resignation letters from 2 former board members. A few longtime employees quietly left as well. No fanfare, no goodbyes. They couldn't stomach the fact that someone like me, the forgotten child, was now sitting in the highest executive seat. And Douglas, he vanished from the media. Only Helena messaged me, saying he had retreated to the old house in Maine, still sipping black tea each morning, reading the paper, and never saying a word about me. I didn't feel relieved, nor did I feel regret. I just felt, more clearly than ever, the silence of victory. It wasn't glamorous. No applause, no fireworks, just a strange stillness like a lake that had just gone calm after the wind stopped. One weekend afternoon, I returned to our old family home, the house where I had once been overlooked at the dinner table, where I had once left with a heart fractured by words no one remembered saying. I walked into the kitchen, where my mother, Lillian Monroe, was slicing fruit. She looked up, paused for a few seconds, then smiled. Not long, not fake. Just a smile that said, I know you are still my daughter. We sat across from each other in the kitchen. No talk about the company, no mention of Douglas. Just stories about how the roses bloomed late this year and about the apple pie she had just learned to make from YouTube. I left before nightfall. As I closed the door, I heard my mother's quiet voice. You've gone so far, only to come back to the place you once left. I turned to her and said, but this time, I don't have to ask anyone's permission to walk in. That night, I opened my laptop and looked at Brooks Systems' internal dashboard. Revenue steady. Share distribution is well balanced. But what made me pause was a small tab staff recommendations. I clicked it. One name appeared at the top of the list, Sierra Brooks, recommended for the strategic communications team. Under reason for recommendation, there was only one line, because I have seen her, and this time, I want her to see me as a true teammate. I sat in silence for a very long time. The chair that had once been pulled out from under me, I had taken it back. But along the way, I had lost quite a bit as well, trust. A piece of the carefree heart I once had. And sometimes, even the gentleness I had saved for myself. Does revenge always leave an aftertaste? And does justice truly make us happy one March morning? I woke up earlier than usual, not to check emails or prepare for a meeting, but to look back. Not to look back at what I had lost, but at what I had kept and chosen to keep. 3 months after the press conference, Brooks Systems was coming back to life, but quietly. No more hollow slogans, no more brand representative faces. Amid the growth figures, I realized that the most valuable thing wasn't in the financial reports. It was in the way people in the company looked at each other. The way they looked at me was no longer as someone who had been randomly chosen, but as someone who had gone far enough to understand why she had to return. Sierra sent me a new media plan. No gloss, no filters. For the first time, it was real. She even wrote a handwritten note. We've all lived through roles we played. It's time to live for real. I smiled. Not because of the plan, but because my sister had finally stepped into the game without having to act anymore. I went to Douglas's office one late afternoon. No appointment. The room still had the old furniture, but now the light was softer. He sat there, writing something in his notebook. Looking up at me, he simply asked, "What are you here for?" I replied, "Not here for anything. Just dropping by, because I'm no longer hiding. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to." There was only a strange stillness, as if each of us was setting down a nameless burden. Before I left, he asked, "What do you plan to do next?" I didn't have to think. Live. For real. I left the building, standing beneath the darkening sky before sunset. The wind was still cold, but no longer biting, because this time, I chose to stay, not to prove anything. Just because I was strong enough not to need to prove anything anymore. That night, I went home and opened the window. I didn't turn on the lights. I just let the moonlight pour in like a reminder. No light is more natural than the light we choose to keep in our own hearts. I sat down and wrote the first lines in a new journal. I was once pushed out of the very place I belonged. I once took revenge with everything I had. And then, I learned victory isn't about dragging someone else down. It's when you know you don't need to hold your head high for others to see you because you have already seen yourself. I closed the journal, turned off my phone, and went to sleep. For the first time in years, in peace. This is not an ending. It's simply a chapter closing, making room for a new journey, a journey no longer carrying the darkness, but the light born from the cracks I once walked through. If you've ever been looked down upon, if you've ever had to strain just to be seen, remember you don't have to shout. Just stand up and keep walking. The rest, the world will hear on its own. Don't forget to comment if you see a piece of yourself in this story. Share it with someone who's on their journey to reclaim their worth, and subscribe to Revenge Mark, where those who have been cast aside learn to rise so they'll never bow their heads again.